Thank you so much for inviting me, Daniela and the other ambivalent archivists. It's just great to have a project that is so focused on such a kind of important, central, contemporary, intellectual field, really, and particularly in terms of interdisciplinary studies, gender studies, queer studies, critical race studies, and so on. And I'm really delighted to be able to share some of the work that I'm doing at the moment on family archives, which I'll talk a little bit about the project as a whole, and then I'll introduce some extracts from a recent piece that some of you may have read, but you certainly don't have to have. And also, just to say a particular thank you to Daniela for keeping in touch after Daniela was a student in LSE that I taught, and it's really lovely to also keep these forms of community going, so thanks for the invitation. I'll just, the great thing about being able to make things bigger is I might not need to wear my glasses anymore. Should be about like 40 minutes, something like that I'll be speaking for. Danielle, you can wave at me if I see people snoozing, I'll speed up. So this is called the Gendered Labour of Remembering, and I've been working for a few years now on a memory archive that draws on family stories, contradictory memories, and on social and cultural history to intervene in gendered, sexual and national histories. I'm interested particularly I'm interested in crafting a memory archive that draws on some of my older work on telling stories differently, and that focuses on inheritance as an unstable, unreliable but significant frame for thinking through the present. So you can see I was delighted to get the invitation to Ambivalent Archives. Memory rather than history is important for me in the project because the work starts from uncertain memory or generational storytelling in order to explore the many different registers at which history is enacted and passed on. The aim is to provide texture to the pains and pleasures of gendered, sexual and national encounter in a queer feminist approach to archiving family memory and memoir. So in the process, what I want to do is to cast gendered and sexual politics and practices as narratives that variously hyperbolize, repeat, engage, or interrogate the histories that we inherit. A memory archive then, for me, is of course a living archive in Stuart Hall's understanding. My memory archive draws on what Annette Kuhn describes as memory work, and that many of you might be familiar with from her 1995 book. I've been trying to retell the stories theorists have told about feminist and queer inheritance for some time during the time I've been writing, but until recently always kind of in more conventional academic form, until in a way, more conventional academic form alongside more creative endeavours or attempts to bring together different ways of thinking. But I think over the last 10 years in particular, I've just got more and more frustrated with the formal limits of purely theoretical tales and increasingly drawn to both the creative edges of the stories that we tell about the feminist and queer past, as well as the possibilities of alternative form for engaging those pasts. What seems to fall outside the text, to lurk at its edges or behind its presumptions, has started to feel more and more pertinent to tracking contradictory histories of gender and sexuality. And so I've begun to look at both family story and to fictional intervention as ways of expanding my interest in the restlessness rather than certainty of what might be taken forward in accounts of the past. Perfect pause moment. So to give you a little bit of detail, the memory archive I've been tracking so far includes interviews with my parents, photographs and ephemera that they've retained, official documents such as birth and death certificates, wills, probate data, census and electoral registers and so on, so many of the things you'd expect. Letters, references, household accounts and so on. It also includes my memory of stories told to me as a child and as an adult about other family members, often contradictory stories, and a series of short fiction pieces I've written to stage rather than resolve those contradictions. So one aspect of that method has been first to write or gather stories, oral history, archival and fictional, and only second to reflect on the work that they're doing from the perspective of my interest in stories of class transition, gender, sexuality and whiteness. And why I'm talking about that cluster will become clear. For the work I'm going to be talking with you about today, it's less about the fiction and more about the oral histories, but I'm very happy to talk about that afterwards if that's something that interests you, although fictionalisation, as you'll see, also does come out in through questions of fantasy and retelling of stories in this particular piece as well. So the twofold process, the writing or the gathering of stories and their interpretation, draws on theorizations of memory work by Kuhn, responding to her invitation to fold memoir and memory into history from a feminist perspective. But so too it mirrors and expands Frigga Haug's understanding of memory work from 1992. Frigga Haug was a sociologist, German sociologist, as a method for working on narratives and memory in order to intervene and denaturalize dominant history from a sociological perspective. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Frigga Haug's work, but she asked people to work from the same prompt to write free writing about memories and experiences that prompted, and then to share those stories to produce a single text that a small group would then work upon to think about in terms of sociological evidence that comes from stories that both are and are not your own. Right, so it's a sort of, it's gone out of fashion as a method. For me, as for Haug, the archive is not transparent, history is not transparent, but can only reveal its political construction and potential to be read and rendered otherwise through sustained reflexive attention. While my memory archive doesn't precisely reflect Haug's sociological interests or methods, it is nevertheless concerned with the realm of fantasy as sociologically necessary to an archive that otherwise only reflects a partial view of experience. And I mean that quite literally, that fantasy is, for the most part of everybody's everyday life. And yet it's not something that we think of as sociological evidence, even though without thinking about fantasy, what could be called the empirical seems to be missing, rather significant aspect of everyday life. So it's nevertheless concerned with the realm of fantasy as sociologically necessary to an archive that otherwise only reflects a partial view of experience. In addition, it's interested in multiple genres of storytelling and in ways of telling stories that might intervene to generate different futures as well as pasts. For the article that is the basis of today, we thought she was a witch. I draw primarily on the oral history interviews and related archival research I conducted with my mum about her family and work on these to investigate what they can tell us about gendered labour, my own as well as my family's, in the making of 20th century class transitional fantasies, trying to extend Raewyn Connell's understanding of emphasised femininities to include both questions of race and labour, and to incorporate some of the work of Alyosha Tudor, a queer trans theorist, who's talked persuasively about the labour of misogyny as part of the driver of contemporary gendered realities and narratives. So at the centre of the work lies the resilience and force of gendered, sexual, classed and national affects as motivating and making history. I'm interested overall in the memory archive as part of telling a story of post-Second World War UK national identity within a white class kinship structure. In the broader project, the hope is to examine the narration of history, the stories that families tell about their past, the familial memory archive, as deeply significant for understanding complicity as well as resistance. Part of my own commitment is to try and foreground the availability over time of right-wing or authoritarian attachments for my class-transitional white family across several generations, a kind of response to what otherwise is termed Brexit shock. If gendered, sexual and class citizenship is tenuously secured through the replay of histories of pain and pleasure, psychic, social or intersubjective, perhaps it's also at the level of meanings interplay that one form of anti-authoritarian politics might take place. With me so far? Mm-hmm. In an interview with me in the summer of 2020, sitting outside on the terrace of my parents' 1930s detached house on the edge of Brighton, maintaining a safe COVID distance, my mum tells a story of family on her mother's side. As if she were right back there, giving me a tour of the house, Mum remembers 64 Chepstow Road, Newport, South Wales, and its occupants, with both clarity and fondness. The house was 4 stories, she tells me, with 3 generations living there together from the 1920s onwards. Albert, my mum's uncle, and his wife Nora, his brother Arthur, the unmarried patriarch, Florence Maud, Flossie, my maternal grandma, Granny Liz, Mum's maternal grandma, Nanny Hobkirk, Nora's mother, and from the late 1930s, Albert and Nora's children, Pip and David. You don't need to remember these characters, they will become... It's like beginning a novel, you're like, who are these people? My mum, Anne, and her siblings Sheila and Glyn would visit with Flossie as children, both pre- and post-wars, and she marvelled, my mum. Quote, "It was the most wonderful house, huge, because you went through the front door, there were the stairs up, then there was this big room in the front that Liz had, she was bedridden. There was a den in between, and then you went through and into another room where Albert had this huge roll-top desk, and then you went through into the kitchen, and then beyond that there was a dairy. Oh, that was my favourite place in the whole world." Albert worked on the docks, coming home with, quote, huge deep pockets filled with sugar, or anything that you couldn't get in the war. Nora controlled food. She cooked like a queen, said my mum, used to make the most wonderful apple pies, using some of that precious sugar when they could get it, or otherwise using soft cheese together with fruit for the pies. Arthur ran a grocery business and was very successful. It was Arthur's house, Mum continues, and he had a suite of his own at 64 Chepstow Road. My mum continues, "You went up the stairs and immediately opposite there was another corridor. On the right there was a bathroom, which he had, and then he had this huge room at the end. In between the toilet and this room, there was this little bedroom, quite small, but this huge room with floor-to-ceiling windows, like a big sort of bay, huge room, that was his room, and it overlooked the garden, and no one was allowed in there. I wasn't even allowed in there. Nobody was allowed in there. Mum remembers that Arthur's mistress, I think she was, who was, quote, gorgeous, also spent quite a bit of time at the house, along with friends of Albert's from the docks and visiting relatives like Mary and John from North Wales. Nanny Liz moved in with Flossie and took to her bed a couple of years after the boarding house she set up when her husband Charles died went up in flames. Flossie was a chorus dancer, my mum told me, and before the fire, Liz, quote, used to take in stage people, so my mother grew up knowing all these quite famous people, unquote. Old Nanny Hobkirk also lived in a room upstairs. She, quote, was weird, my mum remembers. Quote, we used to call her a witch, unquote. Mum tells a story of an eccentric old widow who, quote, never worked. She was always in this little room. She used to come down for meals and stuff. Mum characterises Nanny Hobkirk as a hoarder, describing her already cramped bedroom as filled to the brim with rolls and rolls and rolls of material. One wall of her room, my mum says, was full of these rolls, so she must have had money. And she used to buy these great bolts of material, and Nora used to use it for all our clothes and stuff. She used to make them all. That's crazy, I say, and we both laugh. My mum and I share lots of laughter on the terrace as she tells me about this crowded house bursting at the seams with people who lived there or visited. It's clear that she adored her Uncle Arthur, who would still send her money when she was at teacher training college in the 1950s, and who left Flossie enough in his will for her to buy a cafe and then a bungalow after retirement. Flossie's, yeah. Quote, Arthur was an amazing man, Mum recounts, reiterating that same sentiment several times in the course of our discussion. At a couple of points, I wonder aloud about where the money came from for him to buy 64 Chepstow Road in the first place, and to keep so many members of the family with a roof over their heads. We conclude, my mum and I, that Arthur must have been involved in what my mum calls the criminal fringe, shifting goods through the house, perhaps even those bolts of material in Nanny Hobkirk's room. We tell each other a story of an imposing Uncle Arthur whose grift makes enough money to set up and keep the household going, and who leaves nest eggs for the next generation to prosper. It all came from Arthur, says Mum. God bless you, Arthur, she concludes, smacking her lips in satisfaction. The story of Arthur is a deeply pleasing one to both of us. He's a larger-than-life figure who protects the ageing women in the family from the misfortunes of fires and widowhood, and who lives a glamorous, even louche life in his private part of the house. I can't help myself whispering, I guess that's where he killed them, in Gothic undertones to my mum. It's a story that runs parallel to our more firmly established family narrative of class improvement through education, initially through grammar school education, and then, for the generation that mostly moved away from Wales, through becoming teachers or accountants. Both my mum and I embrace this recasting of our white working class families' predictable, if slowly improved, fortunes as having a more transgressive, glamorous origin. Mum reminds me multiple times how gorgeous Arthur's nameless mistress was. Flossie inherits from Arthur when he dies. Albert is already dead, and a third of that comes in turn to my mum when her parents die. It is Arthur's money that pays for the remodelling of our kitchen and the knocking down of the outdoor toilet in the house whose terrace we are sitting on to do the oral history now. But the story starts to fray the more I think about the money, and I come back to how it could be that Arthur, even with all his ill-gotten gains, would have had a substantial enough lump sum to buy 64 Chepstow Road when he was in his mid to late 20s. His dad, William, would not have made much as a chauffeur or have left much from a war pension, hence Granny Liz needing to open a boarding house after he died. So I go searching for another story, one that lurks beneath the surface of my mum's and my contentment with the one we have told each other so far. Wondering when it was that Arthur and Albert moved into Chepstow Road, I checked the only relevant document I can find, Albert and Nora's marriage certificate from 1929, which shows that 21-year-old Nora already lived at 64 Chepstow Road when she married Albert. It was Albert and the other Joneses who moved into the house, not Nora. I do a bit of digging on Nanny Hobkirk, Nora's mum. Evelyn Hannah James married Charles Workman, a railway guard, in 1907 when she was 20 and a trifle shy of 9 months before the birth of their daughter Nora. Charles died in 1918 and Evelyn married William Young Hobkirk in 1921. When William died in 1924, he left Evelyn £1,508 9d in his will. This was a substantial amount, certainly more than enough to buy a large house in Newport, whilst the house Evelyn's and not Arthur's. She must have moved there with Nora sometime between William's death in 1924 and Nora's marriage 5 years later in 1929. Perhaps she ran it as a boarding house herself, just like Granny Liz, before the whole Jones family piled in. Yes, it makes sense. 64 Chepstow Road, Newport, belonged to Nanny Hobkirk, the family witch who never worked and lived in one room, quote, only coming down for meals, unquote. It belonged to the crazy lady who hoarded bolts of material in her too small room and who my mum and I fantasise is being cared for out of Arthur's grey economy generosity. In fact, Evelyn lived at 64 Chepstow Road until she died in 1966, outliving Liz, Albert and Arthur, and not moving to the south of England with Nora when she did, to be with her own daughter in the late 1950s or early 1960s. That second story of Evelyn Hobkirk is, of course, already there in our first one, though I have to go back to read for it. It's there in the lack of sense my mum and I can make of Arthur's purchasing power. We spin and spin the possibilities around his ownership, never fully challenging it, preferring a tall tale that gives a transgressive whiff to our shared legacy of class transition rather than abandoning it altogether. And yet, when I look back at the transcript of the interview with my mum, my own slow realisation is already there in black and white. It's the most plausible explanation for why Mum's cousins, Pip and David, were able to buy a large house in Bexhill together many years later, splitting it in two and living one either side. Mum reflects hesitantly that, quote, Nanny Hobkirk might have had money, yet neither of us returns to this, and it takes on the status of a passing comment buried in plain sight. Instead, the two of us puzzle over whether Nora's inheritance would have come from Albert or Arthur, rather than from Evelyn, who died in 1966. When I check, she leaves Nora £3,376, again a substantial sum. Despite my mum wondering aloud about whether Nanny Hobkirk's bolts of material were part of a clothes-making business of Nora's, we prefer the story that Evelyn never worked to one in which she not only provided housing for 3 generations living at Chepstow Road, but also underwrote at least one family business operating out of the house. The story my mum and I tell is at one that simply aligns with the dominant histories of gender and class that we inherit. It's one in which women's roles as property owners, business underwriters and benefactors are often erased by centering men on the one hand and also imagining women possessing little financial or social agency. The alternative story of Evelyn Hobkirk's financial authority tells a different history as well as familial tale of gender and class, one in which we are confronted with an understanding of uneven progress for women over time and of the complexity of the gendered nature of economic history, one with 2 world wars and plenty of widows. And yet in telling the story of our familial progress with an embarrassing failure to consider this more plausible route, we fabricate a tale of pride in the shady labour of the patriarch of 64 Chepstow Road instead. We maintain that dominant history. My mum and I work hard in our combined retelling to ensure that our sense of improved conditions for women over time and within the family remains intact. We work hard to ignore the complex position Evelyn must have found herself in. We laugh at her, transforming her into Nanny Hobkirk, that, quote, crazy old witch, someone to be scared of. We tucked and exchanged glances at her hoarding as evidence of Arthur's generosity in the face of her demands on the patriarchal purse. We think nothing of the number of rooms given over to Arthur, Albert and Nora, and even cast them as devoted family members who ensure both Liz and Evelyn have rooms of their own. We honour Arthur's need for privacy and space. It is his rooms no one is allowed to go into, not Evelyn's. And in imagining ourselves turning a blind eye to his supposed grey economy activities as part of a tale of inherited transgression, we both rather like the sound of, we willfully consign Nanny Hobkirk to obscurity. Much as it pains me to say it, in my mum's and my shared tale, as much as in conventional history, Evelyn Hobkirk is a witch. She's never worked. She's losing her grip and perhaps sliding into madness in that small room surrounded by those heavy bales of material that threaten to crush her where she sleeps. Such a tale of effective investment emerging from the memory archive I'm piecing together through conventional documents and familial narrative offers a view of gender as labour, I want to suggest. Understanding gender equality as progress, something my mum and I inherit, rather than something that Evelyn may already have had, at least financially, underwrites stories of class transition coming with increased gender freedoms, whether there's evidence for this or not. And in my family, there's plenty of evidence of ongoing inequality as well as transformation. And if we think of femininity as a set of practices that props up heteronormative familial structures, it might make sense of why my mum's and my stories about Arthur and our pleasure in them are so comforting. Their affective authority positions my mum and I, and all the other tellers of similar tales, as knowing subjects, while Evelyn's own authority is undermined through our often cruel affect. What Raewyn Connell describes as emphasised femininity, that which props up gendered orders and temporalities, should thus be thought of as a set of practices and affective registers that are of profound significance for upholding dominant histories. It's only through a subsequent analysis of the memory archive here that this violence is exposed and Evelyn's story that haunts both the house and the familial accounts of it can be fleshed out. But why, we might wonder, do women tell gendered tales that do not initially appear to advantage them, or us? Flossie and Mum do not, after all, inherit as much as they might have if the house had belonged to Arthur, and one might wonder why other members of the family also maintained the fiction of patriarchal ownership of 64 Chepstow Road. My mum did not present the original story as in any way contested. For that analysis, we need to take a more intersectional view of gendered labour, I think, contextualising it within the colonial histories and affects that underwrite fantasies of white, classed and gendered progress in the first place. My inheritance of a specifically white class-transitional history can be read back into my history of 64 Chepstow Road in a range of ways, tracing the flow of commodities as well as ownership of property, providing a material history of whiteness as a fuller context for class and gendered transitions. There are the goods that dock worker Albert pilfers from the ships coming in, transported from England's colonies. That sugar he stuffs from split bags into his internal pockets was, quote, the single most important colonial commodity, unquote, up until the end of the Second World War. The handing over of sugar to Nora, who used it, remember, to make baked goods for family, or that she sold on, or that enabled a wartime trading of sugar coupons for meat and dairy, signals not only the hard graft of white working class survival of austere times, but also the family's increased quality of life through participation in the legacy of slavery represented by the politics of sugar. Those pockets and pies that move in and out of 64 Chepstow Road frame the house as implicated in colonial histories of prosperity and class transitional fortunes. Nanny Hobkirk was not the only witch confined to her room who scared the children in our first narrative, and nor was she only a property-owning widow who secured generational security and mobility in our retold tale. She was also a white British citizen, one who was able to benefit from the Married Women's Property Act by inheriting from her second husband, buying property and keeping it in her own name. Nanny Hobkirk was a hoarder of, quote, rolls and rolls and rolls of material, which we might recall my mum telling me. When I suggest this might have been something she was saving for Nora or had inherited as a kind of trousseau, Mum corrects me, noting this was probably part of a business. We may recall that Nora made clothes for the family or sold them, and yet the memory of the bolts of material marks Nanny Hobkirk as crazy rather than shrewd. These rolls and rolls and rolls will have been dyed blue, bright blues and crimsons at the warehouses near the docks after the ships came in. Evelyn may have preferred indigo to crimson, I suspect, despite having to wait for that precious colour to come from India or Indonesia, but loving the depth it gave. She may not have known anything of the local knowledge that was passed from dye maker to dye maker on the indigo plantations, but she marvelled at its glow. These are colonial tales that are important precisely because of their general character. My mum's family works on the docks rather than owning the ships or managing sugar or dye import. But like all white working class families, mine's possibility to imagine and invest in a different class transitional future relies on their colonial privileges that remain unmarked. Evelyn and Nora's hard graft relies on harder graft elsewhere, and it relies on not making that visible or including it in the account of the value of hard work so central to white class transitional narratives. The stories that displace Evelyn Hobkirk and that inaugurate Arthur Jones as the patriarch of 64 Chepstow Road rely on both gendered and racialised labour then. They consign Evelyn to being the mad woman in the attic, even while her ghostly presence continues to insist that she be given a different tale. And they forget the material context of colonialism that underwrites the family's survival and fantasies of a better life, a context that Evelyn benefits from even as she appears to be agreeing to her own narrative and spatial subordination. Thinking with entwined archival stories here, we can begin to make sustained sense of the ways that generations of women in my family, with little access to white male privileges, invest in both their racialized authority and the benefits of class progress over their own gendered recognition. Unless we understand her as white, in fact, it's hard to imagine why or how Evelyn Hobkirk would have ceded another kind of authority to history. And from an effective point of view, it also reorients us to think about the pleasures of white feminine masochism, the sweet taste, if you like, of propping up white masculine pride, and the importance of investing in whiteness as a way out of class insecurity, as Hazel Carby has so beautifully traced. In this analysis, then, the stories told or not told by the residents of 64 Chepstow Road, by me and by my mum, about property, inheritance and the war are key to understanding class transition into the 21st century. They articulate the importance of gendered labour to obscure white women's authority and invest in white male privileges, and a belief in the value of both their and our sacrifices to secure a more privileged future for the family. When I discovered the history of 64 Chepstow Road to be at odds with my mum's and mine initial narration, I told her about it over email. I was anxious that she would be upset about having her own version of the past challenged, or angry at my interference in cherished memories, so it took me a while before I plucked up my courage. I need not have worried, as she responded positively, saying, quote, "Wow, well done you, somehow it all fits, things you thought you'd forgotten, XX." Typically generous towards me, rather over-generous towards me, my mum's response validates my capacities as a researcher, even as it expresses her surprise at the new story. But that wow is undercut by her suggestion that Evelyn's tale resonates at another level, as a thing that had slipped her mind, rather than something she had never known. Knowing it again now brings back an alternate thread of family story that may have been there all along. Perhaps it was always there because of a resonance with other parts of the memory archive. Somehow it all fits, she says. Or perhaps it was a reminder that it is possible to remember, even if you thought you'd forgotten, many things at once. My mum's openness and enthusiasm in this new, inverted commas, reading, rather than the irritation I'd anticipated, remind me in turn, at a moment where I'm feeling deflated about the gendered labour I've been doing to secure a familiar heteronormative tale, that more than one narrative of gendered and classed inheritance is always available. Nanny Hobkirk is not the only elderly woman living at 64 Chepstow Road at the time my mum remembers. There is also Granny Liz, who is found dead in her bed one morning by little Anne, her visiting grandchild. A widow like Evelyn, I wonder now about Liz's own trajectory. I imagine her feelings of freedom as well as grief when her husband Charles dies and she sets up the boarding house that she runs with her daughter. I think too about Flossie's labour as a chorus girl, coming home exhausted and handing over her night's wages to her mum, loving the attention she gets from the lodgers and wondering who was or would become famous. Then one night, the fire rages through the house, consuming everything in its path, leaving them with nothing. They certainly didn't have insurance. Flossie's one special dress, Flossie's one, quote, special dress was hanging on the back of the door, and she didn't even have time to get that, Mum tells me, remembering being told the story over and over again as a cautionary tale never to try and preserve anything in the face of a blaze. Such times they must have had, I am sure, before they saw it all go up in smoke, then trying to make ends meet before finally admitting they needed to join the rest of the Jones family and move into 64 Chepstow Road? Did Granny Liz and Flossie rail against the fates that meant they had to move in, relinquishing their own economic independence and pleasure for familial confines and a stricter order of things? Was it in fact Evelyn who insisted on opening the doors of 64 Chepstow Road to Liz and her daughter against Arthur and Albert's reticence, broking no argument on this rare occasion? Did Evelyn want to rescue Liz and Flossie from their increasingly disreputable reputation, or was she instead hoping for more entertaining company to distract her from Nora's diligence and Arthur's insatiable penny-pinching? Does my mum's failed forgetting offer way into imagining the 4 or 5 years Evelyn may have spent at 64 Chepstow Road with Nora before she married Albert and the whole clan moved in? It was surely filled with ups and downs, with laughter and sorrow. Perhaps Evelyn had been on the cusp of opening up her own boarding house, but was forced to give up her ambitions when Nora begged her to let Albert and then Arthur move in. Did Evelyn see reflected in Liz her original desire to fill this huge house with lodgers, her hopes for a lively house to distract her from the pain of 2 dead husbands rekindled? Did their shared grief and relief give Liz and Evelyn common cause? How soon did their raucous laughter and ruling of the roost give way to sober seclusions? Did their relationship with one another tip into the kind of friendship that had never needed men to make sense of it? How did Arthur and the rest of the family persuade these tough, resilient, loyal women to give up the ghosts of their independence and pleasure and agree to their confinement at opposite ends of the house? Or did they simply concede the terrain to Nora and Flossie, hoping they would pick up the mantle and come into themselves? Like my mum's, "Wow, well done you," were successes passed off as Nora's and Flossie's, and were they in turn irritated or pleased that their mothers beat full retreats, leaving the present tense of gendered and racialised labour to them? Evelyn and Liz must surely have had moments where their eyes met again in knowing irony over dinner, when Albert had had too much to drink and Arthur lorded it over the lot of them. Was that even a wink, perhaps, a smothered laugh? One thing is for sure, after Liz died, Evelyn was never the same and seemed to lose heart entirely. She came down for dinner less and less, stayed in bed for days at a time, until she thought she had forgotten the years of joy and plotting she and Liz had shared. Then Arthur died, and Nora moved away with those humorless children of theirs, and Evelyn remembered whose house they had all been living in all along. With a nod and another wink to Liz, she refused to go with Nora. "I'm staying put," she insisted, "but you go on." Thank you.